We are live. Dr. Baabood, we are live.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual event today to talk about on a book talk on political Islam in the Gulf region. This is a book that has been published by the Gulf International Forum, which is also hosting this important event, and edited by Dr. Khalid Al-Jaber and Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen. The book is now available on bookstores and also electronically available everywhere. This book explores the phenomena of political Islam in the Gulf region, and it looks at this very important topic of political Islam in this current era. Obviously, there's been a number of scholarly work that's been covering this topic in the past, ranging from books looking at various groups to the position of these groups within the different states, but also on how they're involved with violence and democracy and the Arab Spring, etc. However, this book goes beyond and expands the topic and investigates more the complexity of the relationship of individuals, but also it talks about the religion itself, it talks about the state and societies and the organization of their lives and the spiritual affairs in the Middle East, with special emphasis on the environment, on the unique environment in the Gulf. Given the importance of this political Islam topic and the context, this book adds more to our knowledge and understanding, and it is important for students, practitioners, academics, and policymakers. There are 10 different contributions to this book, and I will not enumerate them because I'll keep it that for others perhaps, or for you to look at the book. But we are privileged here to have the two co-authors, Dr. Khalid Al-Jaber, who is the director of the MENA Center in Washington, D.C., and he's served at as an editor-in-chief of the Peninsula in Qatar, and Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen, who's the Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East, Rice University, and he's a non-resident fellow at Gulf International Forum. They are the two co-authors, but also we have two other contributors here who kindly joined us, and that is Dr. Courtney, who is a provost and postdoctoral fellow at Emory University and non-resident fellow as well at the Gulf International Forum. And last but not least is Sina Azodi, who is a non-resident fellow at Rafiq Hariri Center of Middle East Program, Atlantic Council. Our three or four speakers today will try and help us to understand what is this book about and what topics does it cover and why is it important. And if I may begin with you, Dr. Khalid, as a co-editor, what do you think has the book added to our knowledge, and why you think it is important to publish it at this time? Dr. Khalid, if you could unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, I thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank for Gulf International Forum. This is a great opportunity actually to be with them. And the forum, he was interested. It was interested topic actually from the beginning, and it's been discussed a lot, either in Middle East, in the Gulf region in particular, or even in the state. And the Gulf Forum, I remember like the first and second annual conference, they discussed that the political Islam in a different panel, and I think Dr. Baabood, you part of it. First, actually, I would like to thank the participation, four of them today with us. I really appreciate them since we start thinking, Kristian and me, about the idea and how to approach it. And we thought about why this subject, what are we going to add? It's a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of researches, many books talk about it. But we feel like when we talk about the Gulf region, we don't see a lot of research in that part. So from beginning, we decided that we're going to talk about the subject, and we will tackle a lot of issues, maybe some of them even like a taboo. And we'll try to cover at least the most countries in the region. Started from the bigs, Iran, Saudi Arabia, then we go to the others, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Oman as well, beside Yemen. So we come with like almost 10 chapters to talk about that subject, and thank God it takes us a while. I think it takes us more like 2 years, also because Corona and we couldn't print the book. But thank God, finally we made it. Why political Islam? Why this time? I believe every 10 years we see like reborn with this subject. And if we start from the beginning, we can go to even like 100 years ago. We can start with the Ottoman Empire fell, and a lot of ideology came, a brotherhood, or even like a lot of scholars came, try to reintroduce the idea to use religion with politics. And that takes a long of time, maybe at least take 50 years talking about a lot of subjects between different people. And the two ideology in the Middle East and the Arab world as well, it seems like it's been superior with two ideology. One about political Islam and other about nationalism. And still now they're still fighting. Uh, secular was there, but they couldn't make it. They always in the back. They always try to push for different ideology, but they couldn't be mainstream. So the mainstream mostly come with these two wings in the Middle East. And I believe the the defeat that a lot of countries in Middle East been faced, especially in 1984 and 1967 with war with Israel's. The political Islam are using the religion in politics become very big. And a lot of, I don't want to be, I don't want to go to specific, just a brotherhood. I think when we talk about political Islam, we have to look at it in the big area. It's not about Sunnis, it's not just about Shias. And I think it takes the wild range of political activists using religion. It's not necessary to be as like believing also just in the ideology. We saw a lot of experiences, especially from the Gulf region. They use political Islam as well at the government, leaders, and authorities. And we're going to talk about this if we have time, maybe later in the question and answers. But let's go specific, talking about the Gulf region, and this is like our focus, our main area in that book. So I believe a lot of things change after Iran Revolution. And maybe Sina wrote really a good chapter about that subject. But from the Gulf perspective, the revolution, the Iran Revolution, changed a lot of scene. The way that we look to Iran from political view, from religious view, and the ideology even Iran adopted is to export the revolution to the others. So because the extremists from Shia ideology, we saw some extremists from Sunnis as well. And I can assure you, when the war started, until the end between Iraq and Iran, the political Islam was always there to try to support Saddam Hussein in that time, to try to market his image, give him a lot of money, and they use a lot of religion perspective to push for that agenda. This is the first 10 years that become like a snowball, and it's become growing after and after. The second one, I believe, second decade, it was when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And we faced a lot of political Islam groups came, to challenge the government. Started from Kuwait, Brotherhood and other like religious groups in Saudi Arabia, and some of them, very well-known leaders. One of them is Salman al-Houda. And a lot of scholars, they were young and they really adopted like some, different perspective. We try to challenge the government when they try to host it, the American troops and the other troops as well. And it's been for almost 10 years. They, challenging the government. They went to the jail. They came after that, with the books and try to come with a different perspective. But the 10 years after, like 1991 or almost 2000, it was the big debate how to deal with politics and Islam from that perspective. The third wave, I feel, is September 11, but now it comes from, the United States from the West, and the invasion of Afghanistan 2001 and Iraq, that also changed the scene to discuss a lot of things related to political Islam, not in the Arab world in this time or the region, even in the globe, not just in the West. We start to hear a lot of views, even from Asia, from Latin America, from Africa. So the subject actually become like a very huge, and everyone is contributing to try to understand, to explain what happened, why it's happening, how we deal with political Islam and the group and the people who believe in that ideology. And also that take us 10 years as well until we reach Arab Spring. And we know what happened in Arab Spring.
Yes, of course.
How long do I have?
You have passed your time, but if you want to conclude, please.
Take 1 minute. I mean, 1 minute to finish my.
Sure.
Actually, I wrote a lot of things. I didn't even start it, but I will definitely would like to hear my colleagues who participated in the book. But again, like, Arab Spring, a lot of things changing. A lot of like political Islamic group came to power, and we saw what happened after that in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya. And the battle from 2011 until 2021, until these days, still have, dilemma. We don't know how to deal with it. So the subject is very important. We're glad we talk about it. I believe this is like, we need more than one book. And if my friends willing to go with a second version for it, I'll be happy to do it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid. Certainly, the topic is very important and very wide, and it requires more than just one volume or one book. And I'm sure you will be well poised to develop this, maybe a series of books on the topic. But let me just jump in quickly to your colleague and co-editor in this book, Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen, and ask him how has the political Islam affected changes in U.S. foreign policy in the region. And obviously, as a co-editor, you also wrote a chapter on that topic. And how you think this book has discussed political Islam impact on the Gulf in general.
Thank you, Abdullah, and thank you also to Gulf International Forum for putting together the book, but also hosting this event. And I'd like to echo what Dr. Khalid has just said about the importance and timely nature of this volume. It's a single volume which deals with a wide range of political aspects of Islam and kind of the fusion of religion and politics, not just within the 6 Gulf states, but also the wider region, including Iran and Iraq. And in doing so, it really provides a tour of the ways in which political Islam has taken different shapes. There's no one-size-fits-all policy, and I think that's especially important to an audience perhaps in Washington, D.C. or in London or other international capitals where policymakers sometimes think of quote-unquote political Islam and sort of have maybe a stereotyped or predefined view of what they think it might be. And so this book adds a considerable amount of nuance. It provides examples of how religious and kind of political aspects have differed over the decades, as Dr. Khalid has just said, but also from country to country, even within the 6 GCC states, which again, seen from a 30,000-foot view, are often seen as kind of almost very similar, whereas as any close look will show, they are considerably different, both in their political but also in their economic structures. And so I think that's, for me, is one of the values of this book, and learning from my sort of co-contributors' contributions has been just how different the experience of political Islam has been, both across time, but also across countries as well, including Iraq and Iran too. When looking at it from a US or other international perspective, especially from the US, and especially given Gulf International Forum's position in Washington, D.C., one always does come across a challenge where memories perhaps lodged deeply in policymakers and other people's minds of kind of cathartic events. The 1979, for example, the outbreak of politicized Islam, not just in Iran with the revolution that toppled the Shah, but also in Saudi Arabia with the seizure of the Grand Mosque by radical Sunni groups. So we had an example there of both Sunni and Shia groups almost within weeks and months of each other, threatening to upend a status quo, which, at least for the US government, had been the basis of its twin pillars policy in terms of trying to secure its own interests in the region. We then had, as Dr. Khalid has said, 2 decades of conflicts in the Gulf with the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf War, 1991, the 2003 invasion of Iraq by US-led forces. And in, for example, 2001, in and after 2001, we had the sort of repackaging of a lot of US policy towards the Gulf and the wider region in terms of a counterterrorism nature, the global war on terror, and again, seemingly equating any form of sort of Islamist activity with suspicious and perhaps radical, even violent designs. And obviously, given what had happened on 9/11, in many ways they were well-founded, but of course it also colored a lot of a lot of perceptions, especially in Washington. And one has to think back, for example, to Condoleezza Rice's speech when she was Secretary of State in 2005 in Cairo, when she stated that she acknowledged there was a mismatch and perhaps a fundamental point of tension where the US was kind of pursuing stability at the expense of democracy and achieving neither. And there wasn't really a way to think about whether and how political Islam was compatible with a status quo in the region that clearly US policymakers had long-standing partnerships with. There had been an attempt in the early 1990s to try and work out whether and how political Islam was compatible with support for democracy, especially after Islamists did well in Algeria and in Jordan in the late 1980s, early 1990s. But after 2001, and also after the experience of the Algerian conflict in the 1990s, a lot of that was then superseded. And it was notable, for example, that in the first real instance of a democratic election after Condoleezza Rice's speech in Palestine in January 2006, when that resulted in Islamists and Hamas winning the most number of seats in those elections, the US and international response was very different. And it was very different from the sort of acknowledgement that there was a sort of point of tension. It almost reinforced that point of tension between lip service for democratic elections, democracy promotion, and then not liking perhaps the outcomes that then ensued. And again, as Dr. Khalid has also insinuated, this became another point of tension after the Arab Spring, when not only did Islamist political groups in North Africa do extremely well in Egypt and in Tunisia, to a less extent in Libya, in elections after the transitional arrangements, once the regimes had been swept away in 2011. But there was also a new point of tension from a US perspective, in a sense that US partners in the Gulf were some US partners in the Gulf were extremely nervous and increasingly assertive about the US and other international partners engaging with those politically Islamist groups and currents, especially in such a time of political turmoil. We have to recall, for example, in 2011, the UAE government reportedly made their participation in the no-fly zone operations over Libya conditional on sort of the US backing away from criticism of the Bahraini government, as the Bahraini government restored order following the protests in Bahrain. We also recall some of the pressure put on, in this instance, the United Kingdom government in London in 2013 and 2014 by the Saudi and Emirati governments, who were putting a lot of pressure on David Cameron's government to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. And that has also been a theme of much of the last, I would say, 7 or 8 years in US politics, including during the Trump administration as well, when Mike Pompeo, for example, before he became head of the CIA and then Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo was one of the signatories of a bill to try and get the US government to declare the Brotherhood a terrorist organization. So I'll just finally perhaps wrap up by saying that even though we now have a different administration in Washington, we can still see the controversy, perhaps this sort of sheer passion that has been aroused by politicians of his Muslim descent, people like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. There's still a lack of acknowledgement or recognition that there should be maybe even a legitimate space for many of these people in political discourse in the US. And we still see that it continues to arouse passions. And of course, as we may move forward to 2024 and beyond, those passions may then continue in perhaps, again, less than helpful ways. So with that, I'll pass back to you, Abdullah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristian, and thank you for giving us with Khalid this kind of background to understand the evolution of the idea and of the groups, and how does the US and also countries in the region look into that. Now let us move very quickly to Dr. Courtney Freire. If Courtney would maybe give us some talk about how is the Shia groups looked at, and how is the Shia Islamic movement in the Gulf states are conducting themselves, and how does this all fit into the whole picture, if you like. Courtney, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thanks to GIF also for putting the book together, and for the two editors for all their work on it. And I think it's a really great volume, and I think that this topic in particular about Shia groups in the Gulf is one that tends to be overlooked. I think a lot of times when we look at political Islam in general, Shia groups tend to be categorized with Sunni Islamists, and so generally speaking, we kind of have less information about how Shia Islamists behave in different political systems and what motivates their actions, whether it's political ideology, theology, strategy. Scholars like Morten Valbjørn have written that in general, the consensus has been that Sunni Islamists actually were more activist and political compared with traditionally quietist Shia Islam. Since 12er Shia Muslims are waiting, some of them are waiting for the 12th Imam to reappear and would until then shun worldly politics. This conception of kind of quietist Shia politics was of course shattered by the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which demonstrated that Shia Islamist movements can at once be very political and even revolutionary. So I think that's one kind of conception that's changed. I think another characteristic of Shia Islamism generally has been that because since 1979 it has had a cohesive center in Iran, it is remained a little bit more integrated across borders than Sunni Islamism, which has splintered into a variety of smaller, more localized political, religious, social, and sometimes militant factions. And this geographic centrality on Iran has led to suspicion, particularly in the Gulf, that Shia Islamists may represent a fifth column of Iranian power. Another characteristic in general is that unlike Sunni Islamists, particularly Salafis, who urge a return to a textualist interpretation of the Quran and Hadiths, Shiism promotes independent interpretation of Islamic texts and thus grants clerics more authority than some strands of Sunni Islamism. As a result, most Shia Islamist groups tend to be linked to Shia clerics, unlike their Islamist counterparts, aside from Salafis, of course. And for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood is run largely by lay people rather than led by clerics. And Shia strands of Islamists in the Gulf tend to fall into two broad categories. Those who follow the teachings of Ayatollah Khomeini and his successor Ali Khamenei and thus support the notion of Vilayat al-Faqih, and those who follow the teachings of Ali Sistani, who aims to separate religion from politics until the return of the 12th Imam. I'd say another characteristic in general worth pointing out about Shia Islamists in the Gulf is the existence of Shia as minorities in all Gulf states, aside from in Bahrain, which could arguably make them more activist or oppositional politically, at least in theory. Indeed, indigenous Shia populations within the Arab Gulf states have faced increasing, I'd say, suspicion since the Iranian Revolution, leading to their exclusion from meaningful political participation in some instances. And because the GCC states, except for Bahrain and Oman, are Sunni majority states, there's been less scholarly attention overall to Shia Islamism there. Although there has been considerable anxiety among Sunni leaderships in the region about the potential for or reality of Shia Islamist protest movements. And I'd say this is particularly the case in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. On the whole, I think that Islamism in Gulf states has been overlooked as a domestic political force and is more often viewed as a driver of foreign policy or as a security issue. And I think this is even more true when we look at Shia Islamists because there is this perceived or real link to Iran. Domestically, Shia Islamists in the Gulf undertake largely the same role as Sunni Islamists in terms of promoting social policy changes when they're in parliament, and outside of it, arranging educational and social activities for members of their community. Activism in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, agitating, and we've seen some activism in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain in particular, where they did join protest movements in 2011, however. And as I've documented in kind of other work on political Islam, there are three main functions of Islamists, whether it's Shia or Sunni, which are less relevant in domestic political contexts in Gulf frontier states. The first and most obvious is that these states provide handsomely enough for their citizens that non-state religious groups don't need to grant assistance in the same way that they do in, say, Egypt or Jordan. That said, there is some relative deprivation when it comes to Shia populations, particularly in places like Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, and so they do serve this purpose to some extent. Second, electoral campaigns are irrelevant for Islamists in places which lack legislatures. Only Kuwait at present contains Shia Islamists in parliament in the Gulf at the moment. Bahrain in the past did include Shia movements, but most of these have been disbanded since the 2011 protest movement in particular. A third activity that Islamists tend to take on in other regions of the world, but is perhaps less relevant in the Gulf, is that the Gulf states don't require an alternate social network in the same way that Islamists provide in places like Cairo, for instance. So these are smaller and more tightly knit societies. So there's less of a need for that, arguably, than in other places where we've seen Islamist activity. And so I think that as a result, Islamists in the GCC often don't resemble their counterparts in other areas of the Arab world. And this largely has to do with the fact that they are in many ways free from having to provide tangibly for their followers. I'd say that at present, largely due to foreign policy decisions and due to region-wide crackdowns on the Muslim Brotherhood, most Islamists in the Gulf, both Sunni and Shia, seem to be largely on the defensive, endeavoring to regroup after a period of regional change rather than promoting specific ideological agendas. While domestic Shia populations have in the recent past been linked to movements for political reform in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, in states like Oman, Qatar, and the UAE, they remain largely politically neutral. Meanwhile, in Kuwait, where Shia Islamists are represented in parliament, these movements have, at least since 2008, sought the approval of government rather than confrontation with it. Therefore, it's not solely geopolitical changes, particularly as related to Iran, which control how local Shia populations are viewed in the Gulf, but rather domestic political concerns have driven regime actions to Shia mobilization, I'd say particularly since 2011. Even where these groups do not have institutionalized political influence, however, which many of them don't now because of recent crackdowns, I argue that they are still important socially. Further, they're arguably even better positioned to survive government crackdowns in the Gulf than elsewhere due to their ideological strength and flexibility in terms of structure. Because they're not responsible for providing materially for members in the way that other branches are, they can take on more diverse structures and functions and influence political and social life in a variety of ways, sometimes intangibly and sometimes less visibly than other groups can. And I'll go ahead and stop there.
Courtney, thank you very much. That is a great overview of the Shia movement in the Gulf, and I really appreciate you sticking to time as well. And I think this leads me to two things. One is to ask all the participants here if they want to start thinking about their questions before we move to the last speaker, and please do so in the Q&A or in the comments section. And last but not least, what Courtney has just explained leads us to the new topic, which is how has political Islam in Iran changed domestic politics, and how has how has that affected Iran's role in the region? And Sina, Azodi, please enlighten us on this topic, please.
Oh, thank you, Abdullah. Thanks to GIF for having this event. And I want to thank Khalid, especially for being patient with me as I was writing the chapter last year. What I really discussed in the chapter is how there's a symbionic relationship between religion and politics in Iran since the establishment of the Persian state, going back to the Sasanians, Achaemenids, and all that, where the clergy worked hard to support the state, and they have always been involved in the politics of the country. In the chapter that I wrote, I discussed there's a fascinating story of the Sasanian king Firuz, who was defeated by the White Huns of northern Iran. So he's defeated, and the country cannot fight anymore. And their king offers a truce to the Persian king, and he has no option but to accept it. But there's a fine print that he has to pay homage by prostration to their king. And you can imagine, as the Persian king being associated with the gods, it is offensive to the Persian king to do such thing. So the clergy, the Persian clergy, the Mobids, come up with a trick, rather, that if he does this act at the time of sunrise to the east, it is like, or it can be interpreted as bowing to his brother, which is the sun. Now, throughout the history, I look at how the clergy have been involved in Iranian politics and how the kings have always used this divine right to rule. All of them, whether you're speaking about the Cyrus Great or the Darius the Great, all the way coming to currently Ayatollah Khamenei, all claim divine right to rule. Now, names have changed, the titles have changed, but they all basically claim the same divine right. Now, after the advent of Islam and Iran's conversion to Islam, the Safavids come in, and what they do is that for the first time, they declare Iran, or Persia at the time, as a Shia state. Shia clergy over the centuries have supported the king in return for the king supporting them. This is a symbiotic relationship that I was discussing before. And we call this the Safavid Contract. The Shia clergy believe that in the absence of the 12th Imam, all governments are illegitimate. But since he's in occultation or hidden from the views of people, the best alternative is to support a king that supports Shiism and promotes it. This has always been the same since the establishment of the Safavid, all the way through the Qajar, all the way to the Pahlavi. Now, in 1979, as Courtney mentioned, there's this Islamic Revolution of 1979, which really topples this contract and changes everything. Ayatollah Khomeini believed that this is wrong, and Shiism has to be, the Prophet of Islam was both a prophet and executive of an Islamic government. And he believed that this has to change. The Safavid contract doesn't work anymore, and we have to change it. What do we do? An Islamic government, which he actually wrote about this before the revolution. He establishes Velayat al-Faqih as being, the guardian of jurisprudence. Now, since then, Islam has been the same as the giving the state or the regime a source of legitimacy. However, it does so by also giving a pretext to Iran's policies in the region. I will give you an example. During the Iran-Iraq war, Islam, Shiism, and values of Shiism, such as martyrdom, were being promoted to send people to go and fight for the revolution and for the country, to liberate the Islamic lands from the presence of infidels. And by infidels, they believe that Saddam, being the little Satan, is being really the representatives of the great Satan. But the funny thing is, when the necessities of state demanded, they had no problem dealing with Israel and the United States and purchasing weapons with them. And when it was brought upon Ayatollah Khomeini, He said, we don't have to know where the weapons come from. So Islam gives a pretext, or rather a cover, to the politics of Islamic Republic to pursue what I believe are the interests of the state. What I do want to say is that Islamic Republic is primarily pursuing the same policies that the Pahlavi regime had and the Shah had, but with an Islamic cover. Iran's intervention in Syria, Lebanon, and in the region, we've seen this before during the Shah too. Iran intervened in Oman when it was Iran's interest. As the foundation of Iran's presence in Lebanon was during the Shah. However, what the Islamic Republic has done is that it has given all of these interventions, which now we know in Syria, for example, with a religious cover. And I'm going to conclude here by saying that I think that while it has been a tectonic shift in Iranian politics, the religion as being the source of legitimacy has not changed since the establishment of the Persian state. And I do emphasize, when I say the Persian state, I do use it with an emphasis, because I think that while the titles have changed, really not much has changed. This source of legitimacy hasn't changed, and I don't think it will change much in the future. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I concluded my remarks.
Dr. Abdullah, you're on mute.
I'm on mute. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was talking to myself.
Oh.
I apologize about that. But I just want to thank you, Sina, for that overall view of the way the state in Iran is constituted, and how religion has played into it at different periods, as it were. And at least for me, this is a really kind of a new light at looking at how religion or the sect has played into the politics in Iran. Well, thank you for that. I think we've heard some very, very interesting points from the four speakers and contributors to this very important book. I am sure, like me, you have lots of different questions. So I would encourage you to please post your questions to us so that we can post them to the speakers. And if you have any comments or anything like that, please feel free to do so. Meanwhile, while you're gathering your thoughts, let me ask one or two questions to my colleagues here and speakers. Let me ask you, Dr. Khalid, why do you think this book is important now? And what has it added to this debate and discussions about political Islam? Given, as you said, and we know, there have been a lot of publications on this topic. What do you think is new? What insights does it have?
Look, the debate is always there, and it's become really a big after Arab Spring, definitely. Because if we talk about the Gulf again, and we focus on that part of the region in Middle East, we can see a lot of countries, authorities, look into the political Islam as threat after when they've been succeeded uh, and raised to be in the power. And we saw that in Tunisia, in the beginning, definitely in Egypt and in Libya, and we saw it in Yemen. So they become to the scene, and I think a lot of Gulf countries, they don't like that. So the debate is always there. How do I see it? Look, if we go back a little bit, 50 years ago, and if we focus more on the history, you will see the Gulf state, all of them, Saudis, Emiratis, Kuwaitis, Qataris, Bahraini, Omani, welcome political Islam, welcome the groups, the leaders who came from Egypt and Syria, and they're like been a clash with the regime in that time. So they came to the Gulf, become part of the system. They invest a lot in the education. They even wrote a lot of curriculum in a different subject, and been like part of the system and in ministries and in NGOs. And that continue. Why they want these leaders, these ideologic people who believe in political Islam, because for them is what that time they're not threat. The threat are the nationalist, the leftist, people who ask for reform, ask for democracy. But with political Islam, is what was like part of a partnership until 1991. Turning point happened. They start to challenge the government. That 10 years after that, we enter again September 11, and one of the two biggest country in the Gulf region, Saudis and Emirati, found there's some, people taken their nationalities, been involved with that attack. And 10 years after that, in Arab Spring, they're watching this ideology become like really big. They've been like, coming to the power. They have their own agenda, their own like beliefs. Some of them believe in democratic system, and I think they saw a threat after that. So it's not today. It's not surprising the Muslim Brotherhood, not just in Egypt or Libya or other countries in Tunisia, and the blacklisted, even the Brotherhood who lives in the state, in the Gulf state, and their partnership with the government before, and maybe until now, we can see them in Kuwait, we can see them, even in Bahrain. But the biggest three countries against Saudis and Emirati, also with Bahrain, he put the whole Brotherhood in a blacklisted. And I believe the big problem that started in 2017 with the Gulf crisis, big part of it, they accusing Qatar to support Muslim Brotherhood because they give them, at least the gray area. They came and talked and be participated in Al Jazeera, for example, on the media. So it was not, they don't see them the enemy in the beginning, but after that, today in particular, they look at it in a different way. It seems the Gulf is changing now, even with the biggest countries, to go back and try to rethink about politics, dealing with political Islam, not just as a group, even with the countries who supported the groups. Turkey, as an example, Iran, in a different perspective, supported like a Shia movement in the Gulf, in Lebanon, in Yemen. So they're rethinking how to deal with political Islam. But again, back to your questions, the debate is always there. It's going to be with us for a long time. And we are in the Middle East. We're not in the Europe. I believe, we still live in 18th centuries. Europe, been fighting since 16th century, 17, 18, even 19, to separate religion to the state. And in the end, a lot of countries succeeded, some of them is not. But in Middle East, we're still struggling, even with, ideology that's close to Sunnis or close to Shias, and the war conflict is still going on and on.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid. Let me now pose another question, but this time not to Dr. Ulrichsen, because I am thinking of another hard question for him. But I want to move to Courtney. Courtney, you've published a book on political Islam, but also it was on the Sunni. And now you've participated in writing a chapter on the Shia, or the Shia political Islam movement. Now, the question to you is, how is from your perspective, the Sunni and the Shia political movement differ in the region? Given that the fact you've published two different things on both the Shia and the Sunni.
Thank you, and thanks for the reference to my other book. So I think one main difference is that for Sunni movements in the Gulf states, specifically for the Muslim Brotherhood, they've been able to get involved in different ministries, especially the Ministry of Education, which Dr. Khalid mentioned, and in that way have some kind of influence through government structures. I think this has not been possible really for Shia Islamist movements, and so we see Sunni much more influence from Sunni movements through ministries of education, of justice, ministries of Awqaf as well, whereas for Shia Islamists, they tend to be working more outside of the structures of government, which is, of course, more difficult, and has led in some cases to their association with opposition movements. So I would say that is one major difference. I think in terms of kind of how they vote with social policy issues, it's quite similar. In terms of how they organize themselves among kind of in social groups as social movements is pretty similar as well. But I think the main distinction really is how they gain followers and how they gain influence in government. And so you'll see much more influence in government in the Gulf of Sunni Islam or Sunni Islamism than of Shia Islamists.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very succinct answer to a very wide topic, of course, but thank you for doing that. Kristian, I have a question for you, but I am going to reserve it towards the end, my own question. But I have two questions from the participants I want to pose and see which one you want to pick. One is from Neil Patrick. What is the depth of Sunni Islamist organization in the Gulf Arab states today, and how successfully has the state repressed and co-opted them? So that's one question. And there's another question from Joke, and the question was, how about HASM, the Saudi Association for Civil and Political Rights? Are they a forum of political Islam? Now, you could answer both or any of them, or maybe some of the colleagues can answer that before I move to Sina with another question.
Okay, thank you, Abdullah, and thank you for the questions. I mean, there has been across the region a degree of repression and attempted depoliticization of Islamist groups and all political groups to some extent. We've seen this in Kuwait and in Bahrain which had the most participatory kind of electoral systems prior to, well, in Bahrain's case, 2011, Kuwait's case, similar as well. Over the last few years, we've seen attempts to try to atomize almost and to work against any form of coming together in political groups and societies. Of course, parties per se are not permitted, but in the past there have been societies and blocks and kind of groupings that have come together, and in some cases been quite successful. I know that Neil's question was about Sunni Islamist groups. I mean, in some ways, the most successful was a Shia Islamist group, Al-Wafaq in Bahrain, which won all 18 of the seats it was really permitted to contest in in 2010, in the election in 2010. And again, the fact that it was only really given a chance in 18 of the 40 seats also goes to the ways in which electoral systems can be presented by kind of ruling regimes in ways to try and, if not predetermined, and at least make certain political outcomes more likely. And this was the case in Bahrain. It's been the case in Bahrain since 2011, since the sort of nadir of sort of, in their view, organized Islamist groups really becoming a counterpoint to of sort of political demands and political focus. Obviously, in some of the other Gulf countries, in Qatar, in UAE, there's no real organized political domestic party or sort of interest group landscape. And in Saudi Arabia, obviously, the situation is very different there as well. So we have been, it's perhaps difficult to judge in terms of an organizational depth, how organized and strong these groups are, in part because the pattern of the past 10 years has been to try to ensure that there isn't that organizational capacity. What might be interesting now, and adding to the question about Dr. Khalid about why the book is timely, is that we are moving into a new decade. We're sort of the post-Arab Spring decade, I think, has come to an end. That decade beginning in 2010, 2011, kind of really came to an end in 2020, that decade of confrontation, that decade of sort of securitization of sort of political suppression. And what we are seeing now is a gradual opening up, more on a geopolitical level so far, but it could also be a signal that the next decade is going to be one that could be perhaps a return to the longer term status quo, with the sort of post-Arab Spring kind of confrontation now a thing of the past. And so I think it'd be interesting to see whether there's any permissible kind of return to organizational mobility, kind of organizational mobilization depth in that respect. And again, in the Saudi case with the Association of Political Rights, they were never really given an opportunity to prove whether or not they were an association with political aims, because the authorities went in quite hard and made sure that they were suppressed and their leaderships were sort of imprisoned, and in many cases have been detained ever since. And we saw again in 2011 with the Islamic Ummah Party in Saudi Arabia that was tried to set up again. We saw really a sort of zero tolerance approach by the authorities, not even willing to give those groups any road to begin to go down, rather than to be sort of allowed to perhaps develop a program that could be seen to be appealing. So yeah, I hope I've answered both questions in some capacity. Abdullah, you should unmute, I think.
Sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute myself. I do apologize. Let me move to you, Sina. Thank you, Kristian, for doing that. That was very direct answer to those two questions. Thank you. Now, you have talked about Shiism within Iran, and I think this is what your chapter has been tackling, as it were. But I think from the Gulf perspective, from the rest of the Gulf, what they wanted to see is, what is the ideology of the Shia government in Iran vis-a-vis the rest of the region, not just vis-a-vis Iran and how the state-society relations within Iran, but vis-a-vis the rest of the region. And here I have a very interesting question from Mira Al-Hussein, who says, what would you say that Shia Islamic movements work through through structures of charity and philanthropic organization and focus on maintaining transnational links through economic activities? She adds to, Mira adds to say that she says this because in the UAE, Iranian hospitals, for example, are perceived to be a form of political activism through charity. So how would you answer Mira's question? Please unmute yourself, Sina. Yes.
Now I forgot. Look, in the case of Dubai, Dubai is a special case, I think. As much as Abu Dhabi has had political issues with Iran in the past, before the revolution and after the revolution, I think Dubai is kind of an exception here, because there's so many Iranians live there. They do businesses there, and so many Iranians travel to Dubai for tourism. There's a difference between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. But now going back to the question, I think all of these charities, hospitals, I think they're a sort of Iran's soft power in UAE. It's the influence that Iran is trying to project. Now, I don't see it as necessarily malign, but I'm sure Tehran would love to increase its power and influence in the countries of the basically the Arab countries of the Persian Gulf. The way they see it is that Iran is a Shia Persian state in a region where there are Sunni Arab states have the majority. Now, my experience studying Iran tells me that this is a great source of insecurity and threat to Iran. And I'm not just talking about the Islamic Republic, I'm also talking about the Shah. There are CIA reports really talking and explaining how the Shah is very much concerned with this wave of Arab countries coming together and the threat that it could pose to Iran in the long term. So I think that going back to the original question, I think the concern is that Dubai or any other region in Iran's immediate neighborhood becomes a hostile environment. Now, through charities, hospitals, schools that Iranians have, businesses that Iranians have there, they try to maintain some sort of influence that could be benevolent influence. It could also be malign influence to make sure that a hostile environment will not be created, which could in turn pose a threat to Iran. Because as I said, this issue of security, I think it trumps everything else for Iranians, as many other countries. So they try to make sure that by expanding and enhancing their influence in the region, in UAE, one of them, there are no hostile environments. This can get even further after UAE and some other countries normalize relations with Israel, which Iran sees as its adversary.
Thank you for that, Sina. And let me just a follow-up question, and please be very short. Do you think that the idea of exporting the revolution is still alive, or is it gone?
I believe that every revolution, be it the Bolshevik Revolution, tries to export itself and its values. I don't agree with the notion that Iran is trying to export its revolution. Iran is trying to export its power and expand its influence in the region, because the way Iran views itself in the Middle East. Yes, absolutely. Right after the revolution, Iranians did try to export their Shia revolution, but after a while, especially after the Iran-Iraq war, the policies changed. The approach changed. Instead of trying to export the revolution, they try to enhance their influence in the Middle East.
Thank you. Now, moving backward, as it were, let me ask Courtney. the Muslim Brotherhood were at one point one very important players in the region. As Dr. Khalid has explained, they were welcomed in the past for being a foe to any other Arab at that time, Arab ideologies, leftist ideologies, etc. Then they were demonized and they became the enemy, as it were. Do you think now, because of the challenge from Iran or from other places, or from the Shia population within the Gulf, that some of the regimes see them as maybe a threat or a challenge to them? Do you think they will return back to that kind of a relationship, or that has already gone as well?
I think it's an excellent question, and I think it really depends country to country. And I think Kristian shed some light on some of the differences across the countries. I think that in general, I'd say in the Emirates, for certain, there's a lot of suspicion of political Islam. I'd say in Bahrain as well, of any strand of political Islam. And I think a lot of the language that has been used in recent years, in particular during the GCC crisis, fueled this idea that political Islam for some of these states is an existential threat. And I think you hear a lot of this in some of the talk from Mohammed bin Salman as well in Saudi Arabia, when he talks about the need to promote what he calls moderate Islam. So this idea that, Islam should not necessarily be political, shouldn't be politicized. So I think that for states like the Emirates, for Saudi, for Bahrain, I don't see a likelihood of much change in terms of the position with Sunni Islamism. I don't think there'll be too much of an opening up. I could be wrong, of course. But I think that in general, there's been a lot of rhetoric about the dangers of the politicization of Islam. I'd say in a place like Kuwait, you still have a very active Muslim Brotherhood movement, which contests seats for parliament, still has an active social movement as well. And I think in a place like Qatar, the Brotherhood chose to disband itself in the end of the 90s, early 2000s. So they're not super active, not very active in Oman either, and in the Emirates, they've been cracked down upon. I think overall, we're not seeing I don't think we'll see huge changes in terms of government stances towards Sunni Islamists. I think Sunni Islamists, though, will still continue to have an ideological influence, and that can be sustained even in a situation of crackdown, or in a situation where they don't even have a formal entity. They can still have ideological influence, but I don't see them being promoted to kind of ministerial level positions in the way that they were in the 60s and 70s. And part of this has to do with the fact that there isn't a rival. Back when the Brotherhood was a privileged partner of governments in the Gulf, they were trying to fight Arab nationalism. And absent a threat of that level at home, I don't really see a big change happening.
Thank you, Courtney. And this again leads me to the question I've been reserving for Kristian, and that is obviously there are in the region, different countries react to different Islamic groups differently, and there is no unified policy towards them, if that is correct. Now, for the United States, again, you've explained earlier on that there were different policies at different periods. Now, what recommendations do you have about for, say, the U.S. foreign policy making now, how to deal with Islamic movement parties in the region, both Sunnis and Shi'is? These groups are not going to go away. They are part and parcel of the society and the constitution of these societies. How do you think the United States could deal with that?
Thank you, Abdullah. Well, I think for a start, just becoming better acquainted at a policymaker level and an official level with the varieties, the sheer nuance, the fact that there is no one-size-fits-all policy. There's a spectrum of different groups and entities and individuals and interests. And in some cases, the same entity can be in opposition in one area and supportive of government in the other. For example, the Muslim Brotherhood in Kuwait gradually moved into a political opposition alignment, whereas for many years the Muslim Brotherhood in Bahrain was part of the pro-government base of support. And so beginning with the acknowledgement that there are shifts, there are variations, and also perhaps an acknowledgement that all political outcomes are not necessarily something to be feared or to be securitized, as I think they were after 9/11, and perhaps encouraging or working with Gulf partners to acknowledge that a degree of participatory politics is going to be probably quite necessary in the next decade, especially if and when governments in the Gulf begin to feel pressure from climate action, for example, from the energy transition. There is going to be a degree of change that will, I think, have an impact on the political economies of all regional states, and especially those dependent upon or based heavily on oil and gas. And so, I think the more that political groups can be drawn into the process of discussing what those changes might look like, the better it will be, I think, for at least US interests in terms of having productive and reliable and stable partnerships going forward.
Thank you, Kristian. And now you've answered this question very well. And I will move another difficult question, but it'll be the last one, I promise you, to Dr. Khalid. What is the future for these political movements in the region? Are they going to be continuing with us? Are they going to be co-opted by the governments and be part of the ruling coalition? Or are we going to be seeing these kind of antagonism that are taking place and being used by one country against the other at different times, at different periods? What do you think this is the future is leading us? And why do you think this book is so important? To give you the last word, if you like, as a speaker.
What is the future? It's really hard questions. The future in the Middle East or in the Gulf. It's hard. It's desert and sand. Everything is moving. Actually, I sleep with one eyes, especially like with a lot of problems that we face. Just look for 10 years, like 1 decade, what happened. Even the most Arab countries became failure states. Look what happened to Egypt, to Libya, to Syria. Now we see Lebanon and even some Gulf countries is like really suffering from a lot of issues that they're dealing with, and they cannot find a way or solution or like a new perspective for the future. But again, why this is important? I think politics and religion in Middle East in particular are always going to be there. Again, you don't live in Europe. A title like God is dead, if you read the Nietzsche, it's not even possible to write a book like this, even discuss about it, because the mix between politics and religion is needed. The separation between church and the state, it's almost impossible, especially in the Gulf region. And even the other Arab countries try to follow that path, but in the end, we saw what happening. Again, the authority like chew everything, even the thing they cannot even chew. Again, why is needed? Because look to the Sunnis part. Since the beginning of the state and the Gulf countries, nothing really changed when it comes to the political arena, political environment. And the religion play a big part. They use religion not to make any really a big form, especially when it comes to the authority or democracy or, make it more people choice. Even in the Shias in the other part. Today, Iran is controlling almost 4 cities. You just counted Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon. I mean, we can, if the religion is not there, it's not possible that they control all of that decision at least, or they have like their agendas all combined together. But again, in the end, I don't want to look to the political Islamic group as one. I think there is a lot of changing happening in years. We see now, even with some leaders, they come to, again to re-questioning a lot of their thought. We see them, a lot of failure happening, especially from the Gulf, Egypt to Morocco in the last election, even Tunisia now with the Qais Said and Nahda Nouchi. And what we can do as a scholar, we shouldn't look at the political Islam as like one perspective. And I believe we need to discuss a lot of issues with them and push them for democracy, to believe in democracy system, not in the ballot box. So this was the big problem that political Islam group faces. And as a scholars, we need to do a lot of researches related to that area and discuss it more and more. And I really think so much today you discussed all of that issue with panel with my colleague. I would like to thank them all, 4 of them here, and also even the scholars who wrote with us from like Kuwait and Bahrain, Dr. Bakr Najjar, or Dr. Kenduri, or Dr. Abdullah, or Dr. Ali. I appreciate them all. Thank you so much for that, really.
I totally agree with you, Dr. Khalid, and also the colleagues here that the topic, and I'm sure the other audience also agree with this, that this topic is very complex, and I am sure we could spend hours talking about it and volumes of books. And I think the Gulf International Forum has done a great job in getting this book published, which is already available electronically through Amazon, but also in the libraries, etc. And I encourage you all to obtain a copy and read it, because of the high value of the number of contributors and the topics that have been published in this book. And I'm actually waiting eagerly to obtain my own copy. I've only read the synopsis of the books and some of the chapters. I think you will all agree with me that our speakers here have done a great job in bringing out some of the salient features and some of the important points that this book has published. But this is only a sample of the depth and the width of all the topics that are covered in the book. So please join me in thanking them all for their contribution. And I want to apologize to some of the participants with their questions, because unfortunately time has run out and we're already over time. And I think we've got to stop it here. But once again, I want to thank the Gulf International Forum for organizing this event, for inviting me, and also want to thank all the speakers, Dr. Khalid Al-Jaber, Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen, Dr. Courtney Freyer, and Sina Azodi, who will soon be a doctor as well, on his way there, and good luck. To thank them all for their contribution and for their insights and knowledge that they shared with us. And thank you all participants for joining us, and wishing you all a great day. Thank you very much.